Imagine for a moment that you are so wealthy that when you decide to go on a road trip, you accidentally destroy the economies of 3 countries along the way. Not through war, not through conquest, not through any act of aggression whatsoever, just by showing up and spending money. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration. That is exactly what happened in the year 1324, when one man left his home in West Africa and walked across the Sahara Desert toward the holy city of Mecca. His name was Mansa Musa, king of the Mali Empire, and by the most conservative modern estimates, he was worth somewhere between $400 and $500 billion in today's money. Some historians believe the real number was so large, it simply cannot be calculated. This is his story, and it will completely change how you think about wealth, power, and what money can actually do to the world. To understand Mansa Musa, you need to understand the world he was born into. Because in the early 14th century, the Mali Empire was not some isolated kingdom on the edges of the known world. It was the center of it. The Mali Empire stretched across nearly 2 million square kilometers of West Africa. At its peak, it covered modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Mauritania. It was one of the largest empires on Earth, bigger than Western Europe. And sitting underneath this empire was something that the rest of the world desperately needed: gold and salt. In the medieval world, gold was not just currency. Gold was power. Gold was how kingdoms financed their armies, built their monuments, and demonstrated to every neighboring ruler exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of the world. The Mali Empire controlled the Bambouk and Bure gold fields, 2 of the richest gold deposits ever discovered in the ancient world. Historians estimate that at the height of the Mali Empire's power, it was producing nearly half of the entire world's supply of gold. Let that sink in for a moment. Half of all the gold in the known world was coming out of this one empire. And then there was salt. In West Africa, salt was so scarce and so essential for preserving food and sustaining life in extreme heat that it was literally traded weight for weight against gold. You could hand someone a block of salt and receive an equal weight of gold in return. The Mali Empire controlled the trade routes for both. It sat at the crossroads between the gold-producing south and the salt-producing north. Every caravan crossing the Sahara passed through Mali. Every merchant trading between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa paid taxes to Mali. The empire didn't just have wealth, it was the source of wealth for an entire continent's worth of trade. And in 1312, a man named Musa Keita inherited all of it. Mansa Musa was not born to be king. He became ruler almost by accident, after the previous emperor disappeared on a naval expedition into the Atlantic Ocean and never returned. He was appointed deputy, and then the throne simply passed to him. What happened next surprised everyone who had underestimated him. Musa was deeply religious, a devout Muslim in an empire that had converted to Islam. And from the very beginning of his reign, he made clear that he intended to rule not just as a military conqueror, but as a scholar king. A ruler who cared as much about learning and architecture as he did about military expansion. Under his rule, the city of Timbuktu was transformed. It went from a modest trading post into one of the most important centers of Islamic scholarship in the entire world. The Sankor Mosque, which Musa expanded and rebuilt, became a university attracting scholars, poets, astronomers, and mathematicians from across North Africa and the Middle East. At its peak, the University of Sankor had as many as 25,000 students. Timbuktu held a collection of manuscripts estimated at between 400,000 and 1 million books, more than most European cities could dream of at that time. This was not a ruler sitting on piles of gold doing nothing. This was a man actively building a civilization. But the moment that would define his legacy and shock the entire medieval world was still coming. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided it was time to make his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he was not going to travel quietly. What Mansa Musa assembled for his pilgrimage was not a travel party. It was an empire in motion. By the most conservative accounts, his caravan consisted of 60,000 people. Some sources say more. 12,000 of them were personal servants, each one carrying 4 pounds of pure gold bars. 80 camels walked at the front of the caravan. each one carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of officials, doctors, teachers, merchants, cooks, entertainers, an entire city moving across the Sahara Desert. And everywhere the caravan stopped, Mansa Musa gave gold away. Not in small amounts, not as tokens or gestures. He gave gold away the way most people give out handshakes, generously, constantly, without hesitation. In every city the caravan passed through, Cairo, Alexandria, cities along the North African coast, Musa handed out gold to the poor, paid for mosques to be built, compensated his hosts so lavishly that local officials were left stunned. The Sultan of Egypt reportedly received so many gifts from Musa that he was left genuinely uncomfortable, not from ingratitude, but because the sheer scale of generosity made the Sultan of Egypt look modest by comparison. Cairo, at that time one of the wealthiest cities in the world, had never seen anything like it. The streets were filled with gold. Merchants sold their goods at whatever price they asked, because there was a caravan in town where the leader would simply pay without negotiating. And then something unexpected happened, something that nobody in the caravan anticipated, something that no economist of the era had the tools to explain. The gold stopped being worth what it used to be. Here is the economic principle that Mansa Musa unknowingly demonstrated to the entire medieval world. The value of gold is not fixed. Like anything else, its value is determined by how much of it exists relative to how much people want it. When gold is scarce, it is precious. When gold is suddenly everywhere, its value drops, and prices of everything else go up to compensate. That is exactly what happened across North Africa and the Middle East in the years following Mansa Musa's pilgrimage. He had introduced so much gold into the economies of Egypt, Morocco, and the trading cities of the Mediterranean, so quickly, so suddenly, and in such enormous quantities, that the entire value of gold in the region collapsed. Prices of goods skyrocketed. Merchants who had priced their products in gold found that gold could now buy them significantly less. Economies that ran on gold-based trade were suddenly destabilized. By some historical estimates, the economies of North Africa and the Middle East took between 10 and 12 years to fully recover from the inflation caused by a single man's generosity. Read that again. One man, one pilgrimage, 12 years of economic disruption across an entire region. Mansa Musa did not do this maliciously. He was not trying to destabilize rival economies. He was simply being generous, in the way that someone with essentially infinite wealth is generous, without needing to calculate consequences. But whether he intended it or not, he had just demonstrated something that economists and financial historians would spend centuries trying to formalize. The supply of money shapes the fate of entire civilizations. And Mansa Musa had just proven it, not in a textbook, not in a theory, but across the real economies of the real medieval world. News of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage traveled faster than almost any news had traveled in the medieval world. By the time his caravan returned to Mali, his name was already legendary from Cairo to the courts of Europe. In 1375, 50 years after the pilgrimage, a Spanish cartographer named Abraham Cresques produced what would become one of the most famous maps in history, the Catalan Atlas. And right at the center of the African continent, depicted larger than any other figure on the entire map, sat Mansa Musa, drawn on his throne, holding a gold nugget so large that it had to be shown raised above his head just to fit the image. The map's caption, written in Catalan, described him simply as the richest and most noble king in all the land. European monarchs began actively seeking trade routes to Mali. The wealth of West Africa, which had long been known but vaguely understood, suddenly became a very concrete, very urgent obsession. Some historians argue that Mansa Musa's fame contributed directly to Europe's eventual push to find sea routes to sub-Saharan Africa, eventually leading to Portugal's explorations down the African coast in the 15th century, and the chain of events that followed. In other words, the ripple effects of one man's pilgrimage may have reshaped the trajectory of global history. Mansa Musa died around 1337, approximately 25 years after he took the throne, and the empire he had built began its long, slow decline almost immediately after. His successors were less capable administrators. Internal power struggles weakened the central government. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had made Mali so extraordinarily wealthy began shifting as new powers emerged across North Africa. By the late 14th and early 15th century, the Mali Empire was fragmenting. Rival kingdoms, the Songhai, the Tuareg, the Mossi, chipped away at its territories. By 1600, the empire that had produced half the world's gold and sent shockwaves through medieval economies had largely faded from the map. And here's the uncomfortable financial lesson buried inside that collapse. Mansa Musa's extraordinary wealth was not just a product of personal genius or divine favor. It was a product of geography, timing, and structural advantage. The right empire sitting on top of the right resources at the right moment in history. When the structural advantages disappeared, when trade routes shifted, when rivals grew stronger, when successors proved weaker, the wealth that had seemed almost supernatural evaporated with remarkable speed. Wealth built on resource extraction without institutional resilience is inherently fragile, no matter how spectacular it looks at its peak. Mansa Musa understood this better than most. That is why he built universities, mosques, and institutions, because he knew on some level that gold could run out. Knowledge, he believed, could outlast it. Whether his successors shared that belief is a different story. Mansa Musa lived over 700 years ago. His empire is gone. The trade routes that made him legendary have long since shifted. The gold fields that produced his fortune have been largely exhausted. But his story has never been more relevant. Because what Mansa Musa demonstrated, without any formal economic training, without any central bank, without any modern financial system, is that money is not wealth. Money is a signal. And when you flood any system with too much of the same signal, the signal stops meaning what it used to mean. He also showed us something about legacy. The physical gold he gave away in Cairo is gone. The economic disruption he caused healed decades later, but his name still appears on maps drawn half a century after his death. His libraries influenced generations of scholars. His mosques still stand. The money disappeared. The institutions survived. That is perhaps the most quietly powerful financial lesson of the entire medieval world, delivered by a king who crossed a desert with 60,000 people and accidentally broke the global economy just by being generous. If you made it to the end of this video, drop a gold coin emoji in the comments. That is how I know who really stayed. And if this kind of deep dive history and finance storytelling is what you are here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. There is a lot more coming. I will see you on the next one.